Have you ever wondered what kind of loyalty could make a creature refuse to abandon the dead, even as shells rain down and the world burns around them? What secret could be so powerful that instinct itself bends to protect it? Before we dive into this story that the military tried to bury for decades, I need your help. Comment below where you're watching from right now. This channel depends on you to keep bringing these hidden histories to light. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear has been classified, forgotten, and nearly erased from every official record. The winter of 1944 brought a silence to the Ardennes forest that felt wrong. It was not the peaceful quiet of snowfall or the hushed reverence of sacred ground. It was the silence of held breath, of waiting, of something massive gathering itself in the darkness beyond the tree line. The soldiers of the 106th Infantry Division felt it in their bones, though none of them could name it yet. They would learn soon enough. They would learn in fire and blood and screaming metal that some silences are merely the pause between heartbeats, and what comes after can tear the world apart. Second Lieutenant Marcus Hendricks stood in the command tent at the edge of St. Vith, studying maps that meant less with each passing hour. Intelligence reports conflicted. Radio chatter had gone strange, fragmented, wrong. And outside, in the snow that fell like ash from a sky the color of old iron, his men tried to convince themselves they were ready for whatever was coming. Hendricks knew better. At 24 years old, he had already seen enough war to recognize the shape of catastrophe forming just beyond his ability to prevent it. The dog arrived 3 days before the German offensive began. Nobody knew where she came from. She simply appeared at the perimeter one morning, a border collie with mud-caked fur and eyes that held something uncomfortably close to human understanding. The markings on her coat, black and white in the traditional pattern, were marred by what looked like old burns along her left flank. Sergeant William Oakes, who had grown up on a ranch in Montana and knew dogs the way some men know scripture, examined her carefully and found no tags, no collar, no identification of any kind. But she was well-trained, unnaturally well-trained. She responded to commands in English, German, and what Oakes swore was Russian, though he admitted his Russian consisted of approximately 7 words, most of them profane. When he said sit, she sat. When he said stay, she became a statue. When he whispered scout, she disappeared into the woods and returned 20 minutes later, circling once clockwise, then once counterclockwise, which Oakes interpreted as all clear. He had never taught her that signal. She simply knew. The men called her Duchess, though no one remembered who suggested the name first. It seemed to fit. She carried herself with an odd dignity, moving through the camp with purpose, as though she were on duty, and they were merely sharing her space. She did not beg for food, though the soldiers offered plenty. She did not seek affection, though hands reached out to touch her as she passed. She was waiting for something. They could all sense it. Private First Class Jerome Washington, a medic from New Orleans who had studied veterinary medicine before the war, interrupted his education, spent hours observing Duchess with growing unease. There were things about her that did not make sense. Her paws showed signs of extensive training on various terrains, scarring that came from repeated exposure to rough surfaces, chemical burns, extreme cold. Her teeth had been professionally maintained, better than most of the soldiers' teeth, honestly, and her behavior patterns suggested military conditioning of a sophistication he had never encountered. She moved through the camp on a schedule. Every morning at 0500 hours, she circled the entire perimeter, nose to the ground, occasionally stopping to paw at areas that made the engineers nervous when they investigated and found unstable ground or poorly concealed mines that their own sweeps had missed. Every afternoon at 1400 hours, she positioned herself at the highest point in the camp and stared east toward Germany, utterly motionless for exactly 17 minutes. Washington timed it repeatedly, exactly 17 minutes, every single day. On the evening of December 15th, 1944, Duchess began to whine. It was a sound that made grown men stop what they were doing and look around for threats, not the playful whine of a dog seeking attention, but something ancient and terrible, the sound of an animal sensing earthquake or flood or fire, disaster coded into instinct by a million years of survival. She paced the perimeter, pausing every few feet to stare into the forest, hackles raised, body rigid with tension that seemed to spread through the camp like contagion. Hendricks found Oakes standing outside the communications tent, watching Duchess with an expression that made the lieutenant's stomach tighten. The sergeant spoke without turning. "Sir, my grandfather was Blackfoot. He taught me to pay attention when animals act wrong. Dogs especially. They know things we don't. They smell things we can't. And that dog right there, she smells something that terrifies her, but she is not running. She is warning us. What do you think she smells, Sergeant?" Oakes finally looked at Hendricks, and the lieutenant saw something in those ranch-hand eyes that he had not seen before. Fear. Real fear. Death, sir. She smells death coming. A lot of it. The German offensive began at 05:30 on the morning of December 16th with an artillery barrage that sounded like the world cracking open. The Americans called it the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans called it Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. The men who survived it called it hell, though that word seemed inadequate for what unfolded in those forests and villages and frozen roads, where winter and war conspired to create suffering that broke new ground in humanity's endless catalogue of atrocities. Duchess vanished in the first hours of the bombardment. One moment she was in the camp, pressing herself against the wall of the command tent as shells screamed overhead and the earth shook itself apart. The next moment, she was gone, disappeared into chaos with the same purposeful intensity she had brought to everything else. The 106th Infantry Division was surrounded, cut off, overwhelmed by panzer divisions and SS troops that poured through gaps in the line like water through a shattered dam. St. Vith held for 6 days of fighting that turned the town into a graveyard, buildings pulverized into powder, streets slick with blood that froze black in the December cold. On December 21st, the order came to withdraw. What remained of the division pulled back through the forest, leaving their dead and much of their equipment behind. Hendricks led a column of 37 men west through woods that had become a nightmare landscape of destroyed vehicles, frozen corpses, and trees shattered into splinters by artillery fire. They moved in near silence, exhausted beyond speech, listening for the sound of German engines or voices that would mean capture or death or both. The snow had stopped falling, leaving behind a stillness that felt malevolent, watchful. They found the convoy 2 miles from their objective, in a clearing where the forest opened up around what had once been a logging road. 6 trucks, 2 jeeps, and an armored car, all destroyed with such thoroughness that it was difficult to determine what had killed them. No large blast craters suggested artillery. No bullet patterns suggested ambush. The vehicles simply looked crushed, compacted, as though enormous pressure had been applied from above. And in the center of the wreckage, sitting absolutely motionless in falling snow that had begun again, was Duchess. She did not acknowledge the approaching soldiers. Her attention remained fixed on the largest of the destroyed trucks, a supply vehicle that had been flattened until its roof touched its chassis. Her posture communicated something that made Hendricks raise his fist, halting the column. This was not the alert stance of a dog that had found enemies. This was something else, something that looked uncomfortably like grief. Oakes approached slowly, speaking in the low tones men use with spooked horses or wild animals. "Easy, girl. Easy now. What did you find? What are you guarding?" Duchess did not move, did not even blink, just sat there in the snow, staring at the wreckage with an intensity that seemed to generate its own heat. Washington moved up beside Oakes, medical bag over his shoulder, and knelt in the snow 3 feet from the dog. His medic training had taught him to read trauma in all its forms, and what he saw in Duchess's eyes made his breath catch. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "that dog is in shock. Something happened here that broke through her training, through her conditioning. Whatever she found under that truck, it is the thing she was looking for, the reason she came to us in the first place." "What do you mean, came to us?" "She was a stray." "No, sir." Washington shook his head slowly. "No stray dog behaves like her. Someone sent her. Someone trained her for a specific mission and pointed her in a specific direction. And I think that truck right there is where her mission ended." Hendricks ordered his men to establish a perimeter, while he, Oakes, and Washington approached the wreckage. The cold had settled into the clearing like something solid, sharp enough to burn the lungs, turning breath to fog that hung in the air and refused to disperse. The destroyed vehicles looked wrong in ways that had nothing to do with normal combat damage. The metal was not torn or shattered but compressed, folded, pressed flat, as though by machinery designed for some purpose other than simple destruction. The supply truck sat at an angle, nose down in a depression that might have been a shell crater, but lacked the characteristic scatter pattern. Duchess had positioned herself exactly 3 feet from the rear axle, sitting in snow that had melted slightly from her body heat and then refrozen into ice. When Hendricks reached out to touch her, she growled. Just once. A sound that came from somewhere deep and primal. A warning that transcended training and touched something wolfish, ancient. He pulled his hand back. "All right, girl. All right. We will be careful." Oakes and Washington circled the truck, looking for a way to access whatever lay beneath. The compression was total, uniform, impossible to achieve through normal means. It would have required industrial equipment, massive weight, time and positioning that no combat situation would allow. And yet, here it was, in the middle of a Belgian forest, miles from anything resembling infrastructure. "Sir," Oakes called from the far side of the wreckage, "you need to see this." Hendricks joined him and found the sergeant kneeling beside what appeared to be a hatch. A metal door set flush with the truck bed, partially visible where the compression had twisted the vehicle body. The hatch was marked with symbols that made no sense. Not German, not American, not any military insignia Hendricks recognized. Geometric patterns that seemed to suggest mathematical precision, combined with what might have been letters in an alphabet that predated anything modern. Washington had produced a flashlight and was examining the hatch edges. "There is a seal here," he said, "airtight by the look of it. And these markings, they are not decorative. They are instructions or warnings. Can you read them?" "No, sir. But I know what they are. I have seen similar symbols in old veterinary texts, medieval manuscripts about plague dogs and war hounds, animals trained to carry biological weapons into enemy territory. These markings are containment protocols." Hendricks felt something cold settle into his gut that had nothing to do with the December weather. "You are telling me this truck is carrying biological weapons?" "I am telling you this truck is carrying something that required a dog with extraordinary training to locate, and that dog will not leave it unguarded. Whatever is in there, it is what she was sent to protect, or destroy, or die with." The 3 men stared at the sealed hatch, while around them the forest held its breath, and Duchess sat her vigil, unmoving as stone, eyes fixed on the wreckage with an intensity that seemed to bend the air around her. Hendricks made a decision that he would question for the rest of his life. "Open it." "Sir, that might not be—" "Open it, Sergeant. Whatever is in there, we cannot leave it for the Germans to find. And we cannot leave without knowing what that dog died to protect. She is not dead, sir. Not yet. But she will be soon, if we do not get her out of this cold and back to medical support. So open the hatch. and let us see what secret is worth freezing to death for. It took 20 minutes to create enough leverage to force the hatch open. The seal broke with a hiss of escaping air that fogged immediately in the cold, and a smell rose from below that made all three men step back. Not the reek of death or decay, but something chemical, medical, wrong in a way that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the brainstem where fear lives. Washington shone his flashlight into the opening and then went very still. His hand began to shake, just slightly, enough that the beam wavered across whatever lay below. "Oh, God," he whispered. "Oh, God." They did not. "What is it?" Hendricks demanded. "What do you see?" Washington looked up, and his face had gone the color of old snow. "Children, sir. There are children down there." The chamber below the truck was not large, perhaps 8 feet by 10, tall enough to stand in if you were short or willing to hunch. It had been constructed with the same precision as the hatch. Metal walls lined with what looked like lead shielding, though why biological containment would require radiation protection, Hendricks could not immediately understand. Later, much later, when the pieces began to fit together in ways that made sleep impossible, he would understand perfectly. But in that moment, in the snow and cold of a Belgian forest, with war raging in every direction, all he could do was stare at what the flashlight revealed. 4 bodies. Children, as Washington had said, though calling them children seemed inadequate for what they had become. They wore hospital gowns that might once have been white, but were now stained with substances that ranged from pale yellow to deep amber. Their heads had been shaved. Their arms bore injection marks, dozens of them, mapping out a history of repeated procedures that made Hendricks' stomach turn. And their faces, God, their faces held expressions that death had frozen in place, terror and anguish so profound that looking at them felt like violation. But it was the documentation scattered around them that made Washington vomit into the snow, and Oakes turn away with his fist pressed against his mouth. Papers in German, detailed logs written in the careful hand of scientists or doctors, describing experiments that had no place in any sane version of reality. Tissue samples, behavioral modifications, resistance to cold, to pain, to psychological trauma, methods of inducing compliance, methods of weaponizing innocence, and throughout the papers, appearing again and again like a signature or a brand, the same designation, Project Cerberus. Hendricks forced himself to read, though each word felt like swallowing glass. The documents described a program that had begun in 1942, a collaboration between SS medical units and something called the Ahnenerbe, an organization dedicated to archaeological and anthropological research in service of Nazi ideology. But this research had nothing to do with ancient artifacts or racial theories. This was something else entirely. This was an attempt to create weapons out of living human beings, specifically children whose neural plasticity made them ideal subjects for the kind of conditioning that would break an adult mind. The program used dogs as handlers, trainers, guards, animals that could be conditioned to recognize specific chemical signatures, to respond to commands that human supervisors might question or refuse. Dogs that could be sent into combat zones with their charges, protecting them until they reached designated targets where the children would be deployed as biological or psychological weapons. Duchess, according to the documents, was Unit 7, a Scottish border collie selected for her intelligence and trained through methods that made Hendricks physically ill to read. She had been bonded to 4 subjects, children designated as primary weapons in a program that planned to deploy dozens, perhaps hundreds, into Allied territory. But something had gone wrong. The convoy carrying the children and their documentation had been attacked, not by Allied forces, but by German units that had apparently received orders to eliminate all evidence of Project Cerberus. Someone within the Nazi command structure had decided the program was too dangerous, too unstable, too likely to be discovered and used as propaganda, or evidence of war crimes. So they sent their own troops to destroy it, but they had not counted on Duchess. They had not anticipated that a dog trained to protect her charges beyond reason or survival instinct would find a way to save at least their bodies, to compress the truck into a tomb that would preserve the evidence even as it tried to destroy it. The compression, Washington realized with growing horror, had not been done by machinery. It had been done by Duchess herself, using her body and what remained of her training to trigger some kind of collapse mechanism built into the truck. She had crushed it deliberately, sealing the chamber, protecting the dead children from animals and weather and discovery until someone could find them and bear witness to what had been done. And then she had waited for 3 days before finding the American camp, for 6 more days through the siege of St. Vith, for the long retreat through the Ardennes, waiting until she could lead soldiers to this exact spot, this clearing in the forest, where 4 children lay in a metal tomb, and the evidence of their torture remained intact. Hendricks climbed down into the chamber, moving carefully around the small bodies, gathering papers with hands that shook so badly he could barely grip them. There were photographs. God help him. There were photographs. Children before the program, smiling in what looked like orphanage settings, identified only by numbers. The same children after, hollow-eyed and empty, staring at cameras with expressions that suggested they had forgotten what it meant to be human. And there were lists, names of doctors, names of facilities, locations across Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, places where more children waited, where more experiments continued, where Project Cerberus spread like cancer through the occupied territories. He gathered everything he could carry, stuffing papers into his jacket, wrapping the photographs in cloth torn from his shirt. When he climbed back out of the chamber, his face must have communicated something terrible because his men had backed away from the truck, forming a loose perimeter that suggested defense against threats both external and internal. Duchess had not moved, had not even turned her head to watch the men examining what she had protected. She simply sat in the snow, staring at the wreckage, fulfilling a mission that had required her to become something more than animal and less than human, a tool shaped by cruelty into a guardian of the dead. Washington approached her again, moving slowly, speaking in tones meant to soothe. Good girl, Duchess. You did your job. You can rest now. You can let go. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, so slowly it seemed to take years, Duchess turned her head and looked at Washington. Her eyes held something that made the medic's breath catch. Not animal intelligence, or instinct, or training. Understanding. Complete, terrible understanding of what she had been made to do, what she had protected, what she had witnessed. She knew everything, and the knowledge was killing her. She stood on legs that trembled with exhaustion and cold, and something deeper, something that looked like despair, given physical form. She took 3 steps toward Washington, swayed, and collapsed into the snow. The medic caught her before she hit the ground, gathering her into his arms like a child, feeling how light she was, how much weight she had lost during her vigil. Her heartbeat was weak, irregular, the rhythm of a body pushed beyond its limits, and now shutting down system by system. "Sir," Washington said, his voice breaking, "she is dying. She held on just long enough to show us, and now she is letting go." Hendricks looked at the dog dying in his medic's arms, at the crushed truck containing 4 murdered children, at the documents that proved horrors he could barely comprehend, and made another decision that would haunt him. We take her with us. We take the documents. We take everything, and we make sure the world knows what happened here. But, sir, we are still behind enemy lines. We have 37 men, limited ammunition, and at least 2 days of hard travel before we reach Allied positions. Carrying a dying dog will slow us down, maybe get men killed. Then men will die, Sergeant, because I am not leaving her here. She earned the right to die with the people who will remember what she did, what she protected, what she tried to stop. They fashioned a stretcher from branches and canvas, laying Duchess on it as gently as possible. She did not resist, did not even open her eyes, just lay there breathing in shallow gasps that came further and further apart, each one seeming like it might be the last. The column moved west through the forest, carrying their wounded dog and their terrible knowledge. Behind them, the clearing where 4 children lay in a metal tomb slowly disappeared under fresh snow. Nature covering evidence that men would spend decades trying to uncover again. Duchess died 2 hours before they reached Allied lines on December the 22nd, 1944, in a forest whose name none of the survivors could later remember. Washington was holding her when it happened. Feeling the moment her heartbeat stuttered and stopped, seeing the light go out of eyes that had witnessed things no living creature should have to see. They buried her in snow because the ground was too frozen for proper digging, marking the spot with a cairn of stones that would likely disappear with the spring thaw. Hendricks stood over the grave, holding documents that proved the existence of Project Cerberus, and made a vow that felt inadequate even as he spoke it aloud. We will make them remember you. We will make sure everyone knows what you protected, what you died for. I swear it. But promises made in war, even sincere promises made by sincere men, have a way of dissolving in the peace that follows. The documents Hendricks carried reached Allied intelligence, where they were classified, analyzed, and ultimately buried under layers of secrecy that had less to do with protecting sources and more to do with protecting sensibilities. The world was not ready, the reasoning went, to know the full extent of Nazi medical experiments. The Nuremberg trials would address the worst of it, the camp doctors and their grotesque research. But Project Cerberus and its attempt to weaponize children through psychological conditioning and biological modification was deemed too disturbing, too classified, too useful. Because the Americans, as they studied those documents in quiet rooms far from the forest where a dog lay buried in snow, realized something that made them very uncomfortable. The techniques described in the Project Cerberus files, the conditioning protocols and chemical interventions and behavioral modifications, were not just war crimes. They were potentially functional. They were research that, in the wrong hands or the right hands, depending on your perspective, could be continued, refined, improved. And so the documents disappeared into vaults where they remained for decades, surfacing occasionally in redacted form, referenced in footnotes of classified studies, whispered about in circles where human experimentation was discussed with academic detachment and ethical flexibility. Hendricks kept his own copies, hidden in a lockbox that his family would discover after his death in 1978. His daughter, a journalist named Patricia Hendricks Calloway, spent 15 years fighting legal battles and filing Freedom of Information Act requests, trying to force the government to acknowledge Project Cerberus and the children who died in its service. She was partially successful. In 1993, the Department of Defense released heavily redacted files that confirmed the existence of a Nazi program matching her father's descriptions. They admitted that documents had been recovered. They admitted that the program had involved children. They refused to provide details, citing ongoing intelligence concerns and the privacy of families who might still have living descendants. What they did not admit, what they could not admit without exposing their own post-war research programs, was that Project Cerberus had not ended with the war, that some of its techniques had been incorporated into programs with names like MK-Ultra and Artichoke. Experiments in mind control and behavioral modification that would eventually become public scandals. Patricia Calloway died in 2007, never having seen the full truth released. But she had managed to locate survivors, men who had served with her father, including Jerome Washington, who by then was 83 years old and living in a care facility in Baton Rouge. He agreed to an interview, one of the last he would ever give. And what he told her in that bright room that smelled of disinfectant and old age was recorded on tape that now sits in a private archive, waiting for the day when the world is ready to hear it. "I dream about her," Washington said, his voice thin but steady, the accent of his youth still present despite decades. "Every night for 62 years, I have dreamed about that dog sitting in the snow, guarding those children. And every night, I understand a little more about what she was trying to tell us. She was not just protecting evidence. She was bearing witness. She was refusing to let them be forgotten, even though forgetting would have been easier, kinder, safer. She chose to remember, and she died for that choice." Patricia asked him what he thought happened to the other children, the ones mentioned in the documents but never found. Washington was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at Louisiana's sun that seemed too bright, too cheerful for the conversation they were having. "I think they are still out there," he said finally. "Not alive, probably, but out there, buried in places like that clearing, in forests and fields and forgotten buildings across Europe. Maybe some of them escaped, grew up, lived lives without ever knowing what had been done to them. I hope so. God, I hope so. But I think most of them are still waiting for someone to find them, waiting for someone to remember that they existed, that they mattered, that they were not just numbers in a program designed by monsters." He paused, and Patricia saw tears running down his weathered cheeks, cutting paths through the age and memory. "That dog knew," he continued. "She knew every single child in that program, because that is what they trained her to do. They made her responsible for them, made her love them the way only dogs can love, completely and without condition. And then they made her watch as the program destroyed them, made her complicit in their suffering. And when it all fell apart, when someone decided to erase the evidence, she did the only thing she could do. She saved what was left. She protected their bodies, their dignity, their truth, and she waited for someone to care." The tape ends there, with Washington crying silently and Patricia asking if he needed to stop, if this was too much. His answer is barely audible, but the transcription records it clearly. No, this is not too much. Nothing is too much when you are talking about children who were tortured in the name of science, in the name of war, in the name of 1,000 justifications that all amount to the same evil. We owe them this. We owe her this. We owe the truth, no matter how much it hurts. Washington died 3 months after that interview, taking with him memories that no human should have to carry. But he left behind something else. He left behind coordinates, precise map references that he had kept secret for over 6 decades, locations where he believed other Project Cerberus sites might be found. He gave them to Patricia with a request that felt like a burden and a blessing in equal measure. "Find them," he said. "Find the children. Find the dogs. Make sure someone remembers." Patricia spent the last year of her life trying to organize expeditions to those coordinates, fighting bureaucracy and skepticism, and the simple fact that 60 years had passed, and forests had grown, and borders had changed, and the world had moved on from war atrocities that everyone agreed were terrible, but nobody wanted to excavate literally or figuratively. She managed to fund one dig in a forest outside of Aachen, Germany, using private donations and the help of a small team of archaeologists who specialized in World War II sites. They found something. Not bodies, not initially, but they found a structure, buried under 6 decades of soil and vegetation, a concrete bunker that matched descriptions in the Project Cerberus documents. The entrance had been collapsed deliberately, sealed with explosives in what appeared to be a hasty demolition. It took 2 weeks of careful excavation to create an opening large enough for investigators to enter, and what they found inside confirmed Washington's worst fears and validated his lifetime of nightmares. The facility was small, designed for perhaps 20 subjects, with examination rooms and holding cells and documentation areas that spoke to systematic, organized horror. The Germans had tried to destroy everything before abandoning the site, burning papers and smashing equipment. But fire is an imperfect eraser, and desperation makes people careless. Enough remained to reconstruct the purpose of the facility, to identify it as part of the larger Project Cerberus network, to confirm that what Hendricks had found in that Belgian forest was not an isolated incident, but part of a program that had spread across multiple countries and involved hundreds, perhaps thousands of victims. And in one of the holding cells, they found remains, not of children, but of dogs. 7 skeletons, each carefully arranged, each bearing evidence of the same kind of training marks and conditioning scars that Duchess had shown. 7 dogs that had been shot execution style, bullets to the back of the skull, efficient and quick. 7 guardians who had been murdered when they were no longer useful, when the program collapsed and loose ends needed tying. The discovery made international news for approximately 3 days. The German government expressed appropriate shock and promised full cooperation with any investigation. The United States released a statement acknowledging historical awareness of Nazi medical experiments and reaffirming commitment to human rights. Several documentaries were commissioned, a few articles were written, and then the world moved on because the world always moves on, because there is only so much historical horror that people can process before they need to return to their lives and their problems and their comfortable belief that such things could never happen again. But Patricia Calloway's work did not die with her. She had built a network, a quiet group of researchers and historians and descendants of survivors who continued the search, who investigated the other coordinates Washington had provided, who filed Freedom of Information Act requests and lawsuit after lawsuit, chipping away at the walls of classification and secrecy that protected the full truth of Project Cerberus. In 2015, a graduate student named Michael Oakes, grandson of Sergeant William Oakes, discovered something in his grandfather's personal effects that had been overlooked by the family for decades. A journal, written in the careful hand of a man who had grown up with more sky than people, who had learned to observe and record with the precision that ranching demands. The journal covered William Oakes's entire war experience, but the entries from December 1944 were different. They were longer, more detailed, written with the urgency of a man who knew he was witnessing something that needed to be remembered exactly. The journal contained information that had never appeared in official reports. It contained descriptions of the symbols on the hatch, rendered in careful drawings that William had copied from memory. It contained details about the chemical smell from the chamber, notes about the specific shade and consistency that Washington had mentioned, observations that a medic would have recognized as significant, and it contained something else, something that sent Michael Oakes to his computer to begin research that would consume the next 3 years of his life. William Oakes had written down names, not the names of the children in the chamber, because those had only been identified by numbers, but names of dogs. 7 names, to be precise, written in a list at the back of the journal with a note that William had copied from one of the Project Cerberus documents before Hendricks gathered them all. Unit designations and call names for 7 dogs that had been part of the program. 7 border collies selected for their intelligence and trained to guard, to guide, to protect children who had been turned into weapons. Duchess had been Unit 7. The others were listed as Baron, Shadow, Sable, Storm, Keeper, and Grace. 7 dogs bonded to 4 children each, 28 victims total if the program had been fully operational when it was shut down. But the documents suggested the program had been expanding, that dozens more dogs were in training, that hundreds more children had been identified as potential subjects. Michael Oakes, who had inherited his grandfather's attention to detail and his Montana skepticism of official narratives, began to trace what had happened to the other units. It was painstaking work, cross-referencing fragmentary records, following paper trails that had been deliberately obscured, interviewing aging veterans who remembered strange encounters with trained dogs in the final months of the war. And slowly, over months and then years, a picture emerged that was somehow worse than the original discovery. Project Cerberus had not been shut down completely. It had been disrupted, dismantled in panic when Allied forces began advancing faster than expected, when the possibility of discovery became imminent. But the children had not all been killed. The dogs had not all been executed. Some of them had been scattered, hidden, placed in orphanages, and displaced persons camps where they disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe. Some of them had been taken by Allied intelligence services, along with their handlers and their documentation, spirited away to locations where their conditioning could be studied and potentially replicated. And some of them had simply vanished, lost in the massive displacement of populations that followed the war, absorbed into communities that asked no questions about orphans or stray dogs, that were too busy surviving to wonder about the children who did not speak, or the animals who seemed too well trained. Michael found evidence of a girl who appeared in a French orphanage in April of 1945, approximately 9 years old, unable or unwilling to speak, accompanied by a border collie that the nuns allowed her to keep because the child became violent when anyone tried to separate them. The girl was eventually adopted by a family in Lyon, and the dog went with her. Records indicated she grew up to be a teacher, married, had children of her own. The records did not indicate what happened to the dog, but there was a note in the orphanage files, written by one of the nuns, that made Michael's blood run cold. The child sleeps poorly, and sometimes speaks in her nightmares, though we cannot understand the language. The dog sleeps beside her bed and watches her constantly, with an expression that seems almost human in its sorrow. Mother Superior believes the child suffered greatly during the war, though we have no details of her history. We pray that time and love will heal whatever wounds she carries. We pray also for the dog, who seems to carry its own burden of memory. Michael tried to trace the girl, but adoption records were sealed, and the trail went cold in the 1970s. He did not know if she was still alive, if she remembered what had been done to her, if the conditioning had left permanent scars, or had faded with time and distance. He did not know if she had ever learned the truth, if someone had ever sat her down and explained that she had been part of a program designed to turn children into weapons, that her childhood had been stolen in service of an ideology that history had rightfully condemned. What he did know, what his research made horrifyingly clear, was that Project Cerberus had been more extensive than the original documents suggested. He found references to similar programs in Japan, to experiments conducted on prisoners of war that matched the Project Cerberus methodology. He found evidence of post-war research in the Soviet Union, in the United States, in Britain, programs with different names but similar goals, all trying to understand the limits of human conditioning, the boundaries of what could be done to a mind if you started young enough and applied enough pressure. The Cold War had been a petri dish for this kind of research, justification readily available in the form of enemy threats and national security concerns. And throughout it all, dogs had remained central to many programs, their trainability and loyalty making them ideal for roles that required both intelligence and absolute obedience. The research that had created Duchess and her unit siblings had not died in the Ardennes. It had metastasized, spreading through intelligence agencies and military research programs, evolving into forms that were technically legal but morally indistinguishable from what the Nazis had done. In 2018, Michael Oakes published his findings in a book that received modest attention and significant pushback from various government agencies who questioned his sources and methodology. The book, titled The Guardian Protocol, documented everything he had discovered about Project Cerberus and its aftermath. It included photographs of the Aachen excavation, reproductions of his grandfather's journal entries, interviews with descendants of other soldiers who had encountered strange dogs and stranger children in the closing months of the war. And it included something else, something that Michael had discovered almost by accident while researching border collie breeding programs in post-war Europe. There was a lineage, carefully maintained, of dogs that traced their ancestry back to 7 animals that had been recovered from Germany in 1945 and 46. The breeding program had been established by Allied intelligence, officially described as an effort to preserve superior working dog genetics for military and police use. But Michael's research suggested something else. He believed the dogs had been deliberately bred to maintain specific traits that had been enhanced or created through the Project Cerberus conditioning protocols. He believed, though he could not prove, that somewhere in the world there were still dogs carrying the genetic and possibly epigenetic legacy of that program. Animals that had inherited not just physical traits, but behavioral predispositions, instincts that had been artificially created and then passed down through generations. He believed that the research had never really stopped, that it had simply gone underground, continuing in forms that were legal and defensible, and completely horrifying once you understood their origin. The book was largely ignored by mainstream media, but it found an audience among people who had spent decades trying to understand classified programs and government secrecy. It was discussed on forums and podcasts, dissected by conspiracy theorists and legitimate researchers alike. And it reached the attention of an elderly woman living in Lyon, France, who recognized in Michael's description of the orphanage and the silent girl a story that she had spent 7 decades trying to forget. Her name was Claire Dubois, though that had not always been her name. She had been born somewhere in Germany or Poland, she was not certain which, had been taken to a place she could not remember clearly, a place of white rooms and needles and pain that never stopped. She remembered a beautiful dog with black and white fur who had slept beside her bed and watched over her with eyes that understood suffering. She remembered the dog's name, Sable. Claire agreed to be interviewed on the condition that her current family not be present, that her children and grandchildren not have to hear what she was going to say. Michael Oakes flew to Lyon and spent 3 days with a woman who had lived a full life, who had raised a family and built a career, and carried inside her a history that had shaped everything she was, while remaining locked away in a part of her mind she rarely accessed. The interview was recorded but never published in full because Claire did not want her family to know, did not want her grandchildren to look at her and see a victim of Nazi medical experiments instead of the woman who baked them cookies and told them stories. But Michael was allowed to use portions, anonymized and edited, in a documentary he produced about Project Cerberus. She described what she remembered of the program. Fragments, mostly. Disconnected images that might have been memories, or might have been nightmares her mind had constructed to explain gaps she could not otherwise account for. She remembered being cold, always cold, even when the rooms were heated. She remembered the smell of chemicals, sharp and bitter. She remembered other children, though she could not recall their faces, only the sense of shared suffering, of being part of something terrible that none of them understood. And she remembered Sable, remembered the dog's warmth as they slept, curled together, remembered the way Sable would press against her during the procedures, offering what comfort she could, remembered the day everything ended, chaos and shouting, and Sable pulling her away from the building, through woods that seemed to go on forever, until they found a road and people who spoke French and did not hurt her. Sable stayed with me until I was 17, Claire said, her voice steady despite tears that ran unchecked down her face. She was old by then, gray around the muzzle, moving slowly. She died in her sleep one night, lying in the sun by the window where she liked to rest. And when she died, I felt something break inside me, something that had been holding pieces together for years. I grieved for her more than I have grieved for anyone, because she was the only witness to what happened to me, the only one who knew the truth and loved me anyway. She was my sister, my mother, my guardian. She was everything. Michael asked if Claire had ever tried to find out what had been done to her, if she had pursued the truth about Project Cerberus and her role in it. No, she said simply. I knew enough. I knew that people had hurt me, that they had used me for something terrible, that I had survived when others had not. That was enough truth for one life. More than enough. I chose to build something new, something good. I chose to be Claire Dubois, teacher and wife and mother, instead of whatever number I had been in their files. Sable helped me make that choice. Every day she was with me, she reminded me that I was worth protecting, worth loving, worth more than what they had tried to turn me into. The documentary premiered at a small film festival in 2019 and received almost no distribution. It was too dark, distributors said, too disturbing, too focused on historical atrocities that audiences did not want to confront. But it found its way onto streaming platforms, into educational settings, into the hands of people who needed to know that such things had happened and could happen again if vigilance faltered. And it found its way to the desk of a researcher at the National Archives who had been conducting an unrelated investigation into Cold War-era intelligence programs. The researcher, Itaiwas, whose name remains classified for reasons that probably have more to do with bureaucratic caution than actual security concerns, recognized elements of Project Cerberus in other documents she had been examining. She began to trace connections, following paper trails through multiple agencies and decades of classification. What she discovered led to a congressional inquiry in 2020, a quiet investigation that received minimal press coverage and produced a report that was immediately classified at a level that prevented public access. But portions were leaked, as classified documents inevitably are, and what those portions revealed was damning enough to prompt multiple lawsuits and Freedom of Information Act requests that are still working their way through the courts. The leaked sections confirmed that Project Cerberus had been studied extensively by American intelligence services after the war. They confirmed that some techniques developed by the program had been incorporated into domestic research initiatives. They confirmed that dogs had remained central to certain conditioning protocols well into the 1980s. And they suggested, in language that was carefully ambiguous, that some elements of the research might still be ongoing, hidden within legitimate military working dog programs and behavioral research initiatives. The report did not confirm the existence of any surviving victims. It did not provide information about what had happened to the children who had disappeared into orphanages and displaced persons camps. It did not acknowledge that Claire Dubois or anyone like her might still be living with the consequences of experiments conducted 7 decades earlier. Official policy maintained that all victims of Nazi medical experiments were either deceased or adequately compensated through existing reparations programs, a position that managed to be both legally defensible and morally bankrupt. But the report did something else, something that might have been intentional or might have been the result of inadequate redaction. It included a list of locations where Project Cerberus materials had been stored after the war, facilities where documents and biological samples had been kept for further study. Most of the locations were unsurprising, military bases and intelligence facilities that had long since been decommissioned or repurposed. But one location stood out, a warehouse facility in Maryland that was still operational, still secured, still listed in current government databases as containing classified biological research materials. Michael Oakes and a team of journalists attempted to investigate the facility in 2021. requesting access through official channels, and, when that failed, through legal challenges based on public interest. They were denied repeatedly, told that the facility contained sensitive materials related to ongoing research, and that access could not be granted without compromising national security. They tried surveillance instead, documenting activity at the facility over a period of months. What they observed was unremarkable, routine operations that matched the facility's official designation as a storage site for biological research materials. But they also observed something strange, something that might have been meaningless coincidence or might have been exactly what they feared. Dogs, specifically border collies. Multiple animals being transported to and from the facility in vehicles that suggested specialized handling. Dogs that, from a distance, appeared to be undergoing some kind of training or evaluation, working with handlers in patterns that Michael recognized from his grandfather's descriptions of Duchess. He could not prove anything, could not access the facility to see what research was being conducted, could not interview personnel or examine documentation. But he had spent enough years studying Project Cerberus to recognize its shadow when he saw it, to understand that certain kinds of knowledge once created never really disappear. They simply hide, waiting for circumstances that make them useful again, waiting for people who are willing to overlook ethics in favor of results. Michael published his observations online, in forums and on social media, trying to generate interest in deeper investigation. He was largely ignored, dismissed as a conspiracy theorist or someone who had become too invested in a historical atrocity to maintain objective perspective. A few people listened, a few people cared, but not enough to force transparency from agencies that had spent decades perfecting the art of classification and misdirection. And then, in late 2023, something changed. A whistleblower emerged, someone who had worked at the Maryland facility and had documentation proving that research connected to Project Cerberus was still being conducted. The whistleblower's identity was protected, their materials released through carefully orchestrated leaks to multiple journalists simultaneously to prevent suppression. The materials were incomplete, heavily redacted even in leaked form, but they told a story that connected directly to Duchess and the children she had died protecting. They confirmed that tissue samples from Project Cerberus subjects, both human and canine, had been preserved and studied continuously since 1945. They confirmed that behavioral conditioning protocols developed by the program had been tested and refined through multiple generations of research. They confirmed that current military working dog programs incorporated techniques that could be traced directly back to Nazi experiments. And they included something else, something that made the story explode across media outlets that had previously ignored it. Photographs, recent photographs, dated within the last 5 years, showing dogs that were identified in the documentation as descendants of the original Project Cerberus animals. Dogs that carried, whether through genetics or training or some combination of both, the legacy of a program designed to turn innocence into weapons. The photographs showed the dogs working with handlers, performing tasks that demonstrated extraordinary intelligence and obedience. But they also showed something else, something that anyone who had read about Duchess would recognize. The dogs looked haunted. They moved with precision and purpose, but their eyes held an expression that suggested awareness beyond normal animal cognition, an understanding of their role that seemed to weigh on them the way knowledge weighs on humans who carry terrible secrets. One photograph in particular drew attention, went viral in the strange way that images sometimes do when they touch something primal in collective consciousness. It showed a border collie, black and white in the traditional pattern, sitting in what appeared to be a training facility, staring directly at the camera with an intensity that made viewers uncomfortable. Someone enhanced the image, zooming in on the dog's eyes, and in that enhancement you could see something reflected, the outline of a person, small and indistinct, that might have been a child or might have been nothing, might have been coincidence or might have been evidence of conditioning so deep that even the dog's perception of reality had been altered. The photograph was accompanied by a brief notation in the leaked materials. Unit designation, Charlie 7. Training status, operational. Handler assignment, classified. And then, in handwriting that suggested someone had added a note after the fact, a single word that made Michael Oakes's hands shake when he read it. Duchess. Not the original Duchess, obviously. That dog had died in Belgian snow 79 years earlier. But a descendant, perhaps, or a dog trained in the same protocols, or simply a designation that had been reused because someone with a dark sense of continuity wanted to honor or mock the original guardian. Whatever the explanation, the name created a connection across decades, a thread linking present to past, suggesting that nothing had really ended, that the story begun in that clearing in the Ardennes was still unfolding. The leaks prompted investigations, congressional hearings, promises of transparency and accountability. Agencies denied wrongdoing while admitting to historical connections with problematic research. Reforms were promised. Oversight was pledged. And gradually, as the news cycle moved on and public attention shifted to newer crises, the story faded back into obscurity, leaving behind unanswered questions and uncomfortable truths that most people preferred not to examine too closely. Claire Dubois died in 2024. Before seeing the leaked materials or knowing that her story had contributed to exposing research that should have ended generations earlier, her family, learning about her history only after her death when Michael Oakes reached out to offer condolences, struggled with the revelation that the grandmother they had known and loved had carried such trauma, had been victimized in ways they could barely comprehend. But they also found something in her belongings, a box of photographs she had kept hidden in the back of a closet, pictures of Sable at various ages, from young and vital to old and gray. And tucked among the photographs was a letter, written in Claire's careful hand, dated just months before her death, addressed to no one in particular, and yet somehow to everyone who might one day read it. The letter is brief, just 2 paragraphs, but it captures something essential about Project Cerberus and its legacy. I have lived a good life despite what was done to me. I have loved and been loved. I have built something meaningful from the ruins of my childhood. But I want people to know that the scars remain, invisible but present, shaping everything even when I am not aware of their influence. I want people to understand that some violations cannot be healed, only endured. And I want people to remember Sable, who protected me when no one else could, who showed me that loyalty and love can survive even in the darkest circumstances. She was trained to guard me as though I were a weapon, but she loved me as though I were precious. That difference saved my life. That difference made everything else possible. If you are reading this, if my story has found its way to you, please do something for me. Please remember the children and the dogs of Project Cerberus. Remember what was done to them, what they suffered, what they survived, and what they did not survive. Remember Duchess, sitting in snow beside a ruined truck, refusing to abandon the dead because someone needed to bear witness. Remember that such things happened, that they could happen again, that vigilance and outrage are not luxuries, but necessities. Remember, and do not look away. The letter has been reproduced in various articles and documentaries about Project Cerberus, becoming something like an epitaph for victims who mostly have no graves, no markers, no official acknowledgement of their suffering. It has been read at memorials and conferences, quoted in academic papers and activist speeches, becoming a touchstone for people trying to grapple with historical atrocities and their modern resonances. And in Maryland, in a facility that still operates under classified protocols, there are dogs that carry the genetic and behavioral legacy of animals trained to guard children who had been turned into weapons. Dogs that work with handlers who may or may not understand the full history of the protocols they employ. Dogs that, if they could speak, might tell stories that would make Duchess's vigil seem like just the first chapter in a much longer, much darker narrative. Michael Oakes continues his research, continues filing Freedom of Information Act requests, and lawsuit after lawsuit, continues trying to force transparency from systems designed to resist it. He is 62 years old now, aware that time is not on his side, that the window for accountability grows narrower with each passing year as witnesses die and documents decay and official histories solidify into forms that resist revision. But he persists, driven by his grandfather's journal and Washington's coordinates and Claire's letter, driven by the knowledge that somewhere there are still victims waiting to be found, still secrets waiting to be exposed, still dogs carrying burdens they should never have been asked to bear. And sometimes, late at night, when sleep refuses to come, he thinks about that photograph. The one showing Charlie Seven staring at the camera with eyes that seem to hold too much understanding. He thinks about what it means that 79 years after Duchess died in Belgian snow, there are still dogs being trained in protocols developed by Nazi scientists, still children somewhere being shaped by techniques that should have been consigned to history's darkest chapters. He thinks about the clearing in the Ardennes, now just another section of forest where tourists hike, and birds sing, and nothing remains to mark what happened there, except a few persistent memories and a cairn of stones that has long since disappeared. He thinks about 4 children in a metal tomb and a dog that refused to let them be forgotten. And he wonders, as anyone who knows this story must wonder, whether we have learned anything at all, whether Project Cerberus ended or simply evolved, whether the Guardians are still out there, still watching, still bearing witness to atrocities we would prefer to ignore. The answer, uncomfortable and persistent, is that we do not know, cannot know, will not know until we demand transparency with enough force to overcome institutional resistance to truth. Until then, the story remains unfinished, its final chapter still being written in facilities we cannot access, by people who will not speak, involving victims who have no voice. Duchess is dead, buried in snow that melted long ago. But what she protected, what she died for, what she tried to expose, that remains, hidden in vaults and classified documents and genetic codes passed down through generations, hidden in memories that survivors like Claire carried to their graves, hidden in training facilities where dogs learn to do things that no animal should know how to do. Remember them. Remember all of them. The children and the dogs and the soldiers who witnessed something that changed them forever. Remember that evil does not announce itself clearly, but hides behind justifications and classifications and the simple human tendency to look away from things that disturb our comfortable narratives. Remember and refuse to forget, because forgetting is complicity, because silence is permission, because somewhere, right now, there might be a dog sitting vigil over secrets that need to be exposed, waiting for someone brave enough to look, patient enough to investigate, stubborn enough to demand truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. The war ended. Project Cerberus did not. It merely changed form, adapted, survived. And until we acknowledge that fully, until we confront what we did with knowledge gained through atrocity, until we stop justifying research that treats living beings as tools and weapons and experimental subjects, the story continues. Duchess is watching still, through the eyes of descendants and the persistence of memory and the uncomfortable questions that refuse to be silenced. She is waiting for us to be worthy of what she tried to protect, waiting for us to care enough to finish what she started, waiting for us to remember. If this story has shaken you, if it has made you question what you thought you knew about history and research and the limits of acceptable behavior, then good. That discomfort is appropriate. That horror is justified. Let it move you toward something productive, toward demanding accountability, toward refusing to accept official narratives that paper over atrocities with classifications and justifications. And perhaps, in your own way, follow the example set by a border collie who sat in snow beside the dead and refused to abandon them. Bear witness, refuse to forget. Demand truth even when truth is uncomfortable, especially when truth is uncomfortable. That is how we honor Duchess and the children she died protecting. That is how we ensure that Project Cerberus and everything it represents is truly ended, not simply hidden better. That is how we become worthy of the guardians who tried to save us from ourselves. In the name of those who suffered, in memory of those who died, in hope for those who survive and those yet to come, we must turn to what offers true redemption. The evil documented here, the cruelty and violation and systematic destruction of innocence, these are not abstractions or historical curiosities. They are evidence of humanity's capacity for darkness, proof that without moral foundation, without divine guidance, without submission to something greater than our own desires and justifications, we will always find reasons to hurt each other. Turn to God. Turn to Jesus Christ, not as escape from responsibility, but as foundation for true accountability. Not as comfort in the face of horror, but as light that exposes horror for what it is. Not as excuse for inaction, but as motivation for justice that transcends human systems of power and secrecy. The children of Project Cerberus needed more than research protocols could provide. They needed love, protection, dignity. They needed someone to recognize their inherent worth, their creation in God's image, their right to childhood and innocence and safety. Those who harmed them forgot or rejected those truths, reducing human beings to numbers and experiments and expendable resources. Do not make that mistake. Do not let the horror of this story fade into comfortable distance. Hold it close. Let it change you. Let it drive you toward faith that demands justice, toward love that protects the vulnerable, toward truth that cannot be classified or hidden or justified away. Remember, Duchess. Remember the children. Remember that we are all guardians of something precious, all responsible for bearing witness, all called to refuse complicity with evil, no matter how it presents itself. And remember that redemption is possible, healing is possible, justice is possible, but only if we commit ourselves to seeking them with the same persistence that Duchess showed in her vigil, the same refusal to abandon what matters that defined her final act. May God grant us the courage to remember, the strength to act, and the wisdom to ensure that such things never happen again. May we be worthy of the guardians who died trying to protect the innocent. May we honor their sacrifice by becoming people who choose truth over comfort, justice over convenience, love over indifference. In Jesus' name, may we remember, may we act, may we be changed.